The sun barely peeked through the smoky haze that blanketed what was once known as America. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of decay and destruction. The nation that had been ravaged by the undead was now a mere shadow of its former self. Years of bloodshed, lost battles, and near extinction had left the survivors with little hope, but some had dared to believe that the nightmare was over. They were wrong. In a small, desolate town called New Hope, the last bastion of organized human resistance clung to survival. Within its walls, life had slowly resumed a fragile semblance of normalcy. People rebuilt homes, tended to crops, and lived in constant fear of the next attack. For many, the worst was over, or so they thought. Elliot Warren, once a soldier, now a weary leader in the resistance, stood on the outskirts of town, his gaze fixed on the horizon. A feeling of unease gnawed at him. The world had been eerily quiet for weeks now, too quiet. He couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something was coming, something far worse than the scattered undead hordes that still roamed the wastelands. "It's over," Elliot, his old friend, Maria, had told him a week ago. "We've won. We've rebuilt." But Elliot wasn't so sure. The undead were never truly gone. There were still pockets of them hidden deep in the forests, in the abandoned cities, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. As he stood there, staring into the distance, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. A faint vibration at first, almost like a distant earthquake. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He quickly turned and sprinted back toward New Hope, his mind racing. Was it an aftershock of the past? Or something worse? He reached the town in a matter of minutes, his boots pounding against the cracked pavement. People were already running, shouting, and scrambling for cover. Panic spread like wildfire. The town's small defense force quickly mobilized, but the unease lingered in the air. Something was coming, but what? Inside the command center, Elliot met with Maria, who was already preparing for the worst. "What are we facing, Elliot?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "I don't know," he replied, his hand gripping the map on the table. "But we need to prepare for anything. This doesn't feel like the usual stragglers. It's different." Suddenly, a young scout burst through the door, her face pale. "Sir, you need to see this." Elliot and Maria followed the scout outside, their eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, a faint, but unmistakable sound echoed across the barren landscape, the low, guttural moans of the undead. But it wasn't the usual disorganized shuffle. There was something more calculated, more synchronized about it. And then, they saw it. A massive wave of zombies, moving in perfect unison, appeared over the ridge. They were different from the mindless creatures they had fought before. These weren't just reanimated corpses. These zombies were evolving, learning how to coordinate, how to strategize. "What the hell?" Elliot muttered, his voice trembling. He had never seen anything like this. The undead had always been a chaotic, unpredictable force of nature. But now, it seemed they were adapting. "We can't just fight them off like before," Maria said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We need a new plan." Elliot clenched his fists. He had fought too long, too hard, to see everything he had built crumble again. This was no longer just about survival. It was about something more, something he couldn't quite put into words. The attack began. The undead surged forward with terrifying precision, their movements eerily coordinated. They were no longer just mindless creatures, but an organized army. The people of New Hope scrambled to defend themselves, but the odds were stacked against them. The town's defenses were no match for the relentless onslaught. As the battle raged, Elliot's mind raced. The question that haunted him now was clear: how could they fight an enemy that had learned to fight back? In the chaos, Elliot spotted something else, something even more terrifying. Among the zombies, there were figures that were different. Tall, twisted shapes that moved with unnatural grace. They were something else entirely, something new. Skinwalkers. These creatures, half human, half undead, had once been the stuff of legend. But now, they were real, and they were hunting them. We need to fall back. Maria shouted, pulling Elliot away from the chaos. But it was too late. The battle for dead America had just begun. And this time, the undead were smarter. Deadlier. Elliot and Maria barely escaped with their lives, but the fate of New Hope remained uncertain. The true war for humanity's survival was only beginning, and the undead were more terrifying than they had ever been before. End of Part 1. This is Part 1 of the story. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with Part 2. The night after the battle, the town of New Hope was eerily silent. The screams, the gunfire, and the frantic shouts of the survivors had faded, leaving only the faint hum of the wind. But for Elliot Warren, sleep was elusive. The battle had been far worse than he could have imagined, and his mind raced with the horrors he'd witnessed. He sat in the command center, staring at the map spread out before him. The undead army had already overrun several nearby settlements, but this was different. The zombies were no longer just the mindless creatures they had battled in the past. They were evolving. Adapting. Learning. What do we do now? Maria's voice broke through his thoughts as she entered the room, her expression grim. She took a seat across from him, her eyes scanning the map. We regroup, Elliot said, his voice cold. We don't have much time. We need to prepare for another wave. Another wave? Maria asked, disbelief in her tone. How do you know they'll come back? Elliot leaned forward, his fingers tracing the lines on the map, highlighting the various safe zones that had been overrun. Because they're smarter now. They don't just attack randomly. They're strategizing. Coordinating. We've faced them before, but we've never seen anything like this. Maria's eyes narrowed. You think they've learned to plan? Elliot nodded slowly. Yes. And that means we're dealing with something new. Something dangerous. If we don't act fast, we won't just lose New Hope. We'll lose everything. Outside, the survivors were beginning to rebuild. Some were burying the dead. Others were fortifying the town's walls. But despite their efforts, the fear in the air was palpable. The enemy was coming, and they weren't just fighting zombies anymore. As the night stretched on, Elliot and Maria discussed their options. They could flee, but there was nowhere left to go. The world beyond New Hope was even more hostile, more overrun with the undead than they could imagine. They had no choice but to fight. We need to find the source, Elliot said suddenly, his voice sharp. There's got to be a central point where all of this is coming from. If we can stop it, we can cut off their ability to coordinate. Maria looked at him, her brow furrowing. Do you think it's possible? That the zombies have a central command? It's our only shot, Elliot replied. The undead were never this organized before. Someone or something is pulling the strings, and if we find it, we might have a chance. The next morning, the survivors gathered in the town square. Everyone knew the stakes now. The war for survival had just begun, and there was no turning back. The new, evolved zombies had shown that they were more than just mindless predators. They were a force to be reckoned with. Elliot addressed the crowd, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Listen up. We are at war, and this time, it's not just about surviving. It's about fighting back. We've been given a chance to stop this before it spreads beyond New Hope. But we need everyone. We need to work together. He looked at the faces before him, young and old, veterans and newcomers, all of them had seen their lives shattered by the undead. But now, they had a purpose. We're going on the offensive, Elliot continued. We're going to find out where this threat is coming from, and we're going to stop it. Maria stepped forward, joining Elliot at the front of the group. We'll need scouts, fighters, medics, everyone. This is going to be dangerous, but we can't wait for them to come to us. We'll take the fight to them. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some of fear, others of determination. It was clear that New Hope was their last chance. And with it, the survival of humanity itself. Over the next few hours, the town's defenses were reinforced. Gates were sealed, watchtowers were manned, and weapons were distributed. The plan was set. They would venture out at dawn, heading towards the nearest abandoned city, the epicenter of the undead surge. Elliot was certain that the key to defeating this new enemy lay within the heart of that ruined city. As night fell once again, Elliot stood atop one of the watchtowers, looking out over New Hope. The lights from the town flickered like a faint heartbeat in the dark. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about saving New Hope, it was about stopping something that could destroy the last remnants of humanity. Beside him, Maria stood silently, watching the horizon. "Do you really think we can do this, Elliot?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But we have to try. If we don't, the world as we know it is over." The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of their shared understanding. Tomorrow, they would leave everything behind and march into the unknown. The war had just begun, and it would take everything they had to survive it. End of Part 2. Let me know if you want to continue with Part 3. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale, cold light across the barren landscape. The survivors of New Hope were gathered just outside the town's walls, preparing for the journey ahead. The sounds of bustling activity filled the air, the clinking of weapons being checked, the rustling of packs being secured, and the murmurs of those unsure if they would return. Elliot stood at the front, his gaze steely and focused. He looked over the group of survivors who had chosen to venture out with him, Maria, the town's best medic, a group of seasoned fighters, and a handful of scouts. They were the last hope of humanity, and their mission was clear: reach the abandoned city at the center of the outbreak and uncover the source of the zombie horde. "We leave now," Elliot announced, his voice steady. "Keep your eyes open, stay sharp, and trust no one but the people standing next to you. We're heading into the heart of the nightmare. Stay together, and we'll make it back." The group nodded, and one by one, they began to move. Their journey would take them through treacherous terrain, abandoned towns, and the decaying remnants of civilization. They couldn't afford to waste time or energy, but they had no choice. The undead were growing stronger, more organized, and time was running out. As they walked through the desolate wasteland, the weight of what had happened to the world hung heavy in the air. Cities that were once filled with life and laughter were now nothing more than ghost towns, consumed by the dead. The landscape had become a graveyard, with nature reclaiming the land while humanity had been left to fight for its survival. Every step felt like a risk. The roads were overgrown, the buildings collapsing under their own weight. It was as though the entire world had been left to rot, and the survivors were the last remnants of a dying race. "Keep your distance," Elliot said, glancing back at the group. "We don't know if they're still out there, watching us." The closer they got to the city, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the air itself was thick with danger. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the corner of their vision, and every creak of a branch or rustling of leaves made their hearts race. Maria walked beside Elliot, her face tense. "Do you really think this is the source?" she asked in a low voice. Elliot's eyes narrowed as he scanned the path ahead. "I don't know. But we have to try. If the zombies are evolving, coordinating, then there has to be something, or someone, behind it. We need answers, and the only place we haven't looked is there." The city loomed in the distance now, a crumbling silhouette against the gray sky. It had once been a thriving metropolis, full of people, commerce, and life. Now, it was nothing more than a decaying ruin, swallowed by the undead and nature's slow but steady reclamation. "Stay alert," Elliot said, his voice low. "We're getting close." As they entered the outskirts of the city, the silence was deafening. There were no sounds of life, only the occasional distant moan of the undead, echoing off the empty streets. The buildings were skeletal remains, their windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. The city had been abandoned for years, yet the ominous presence of the undead still lingered, like a shadow that never left. Suddenly, one of the scouts stopped, raising a hand. "Something's not right," he muttered. Elliot and the others paused, instinctively reaching for their weapons. The air was thick with tension, every sense heightened. They could feel it, the unease that came with being this close to the epicenter of the outbreak. "Stay close," Elliot ordered, his voice commanding. The group moved cautiously through the desolate streets, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the open areas where they could be spotted by wandering zombies. The ruined city was a labyrinth of collapsed buildings, overgrown with vines and weeds. It was as though the earth itself had begun to swallow the city, erasing all traces of human civilization. They rounded a corner and stopped dead in their tracks. Ahead of them stood a massive, once grand building, the central hub of the city, now a twisted monument to the end of the world. The building was dark, its windows completely blacked out, giving it an eerie, foreboding presence. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. "This is where it all started." As they approached the building, the sounds of distant groans grew louder. Zombies. But there was something different about the way they moved. They weren't aimlessly wandering, they were heading somewhere, moving with purpose. "Get ready," Elliot whispered, his hand gripping his rifle. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from within the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of doors slamming open. From the shadows, figures emerged, not just zombies, but something far worse. Skinwalkers. Their twisted forms slithered out from the darkness, their eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. They weren't just undead creatures. They were the next step in evolution, a perversion of both man and monster. Elliot's heart raced. This was it, the heart of the nightmare. But now, it wasn't just survival. It was a fight for the future of humanity. "Move out," he shouted. The battle had begun. End of Part 3. Would you like to continue with Part 4? Let me know. The moment Elliot shouted, chaos erupted. The skinwalkers, grotesque and unrecognizable, charged forward with unnatural speed, their eyes burning with a feral hunger. They were faster than the typical zombies, more agile, and their movements were eerily calculated. Unlike the mindless undead, these creatures seemed to be fully aware of their surroundings, able to coordinate and plan. "Fall back! Fall back!" Elliot yelled, pushing Maria and the others toward the nearby cover of a collapsed building. The survivors scattered, trying to stay out of the line of sight of the skinwalkers, but the creatures were relentless. They were closing in, their guttural growls growing louder, their footsteps pounding the cracked pavement like an impending storm. Maria took a deep breath and drew her weapon, her hands trembling but steady. "We're not going to outrun them, Elliot. We need to fight." Elliot gritted his teeth. "I know. But we need a plan." In the chaos, a few of the fighters had already engaged the skinwalkers. Gunfire rang out in the distance, followed by the sickening sounds of tearing flesh. The skinwalkers were taking hits, but they didn't go down easily. Their grotesque, twisted bodies absorbed bullets like they were nothing. They were something entirely different, not zombies, but something more dangerous, more evolved. Elliot motioned for a small group of survivors to follow him. "We're going to flank them. We can't take them head-on. We need to find a way to get inside that building." The team moved quickly, navigating through the wreckage of the city with practiced precision. Every corner they turned felt like a death sentence, and every shadow was a potential hiding place for more of those creatures. They could hear the skinwalkers close behind, their eerie growls echoing in the empty streets. The tension was unbearable. They had no idea how many more of these things there were. For all they knew, the entire building was crawling with them, waiting for an opportunity to strike. As they reached the side of the building, Elliot quickly scanned the area for an entrance. The front doors were wide open, but he knew better than to rush in without a plan. He motioned for Maria to follow him as he moved around the side, searching for a back entrance. Finally, they found a rusted door barely hanging on its hinges. It creaked loudly as Elliot pushed it open, and they slipped inside, moving as quietly as possible. The interior of the building was dark, the air thick with the smell of decay. The walls were lined with old, overturned furniture, the remnants of a once thriving establishment now reduced to ruins. "Stay alert," Elliot whispered. "They could be anywhere." The survivors moved deeper into the building, staying close together. Their footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, a constant reminder of how alone they were in this twisted world. The deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. "We need to find the source," Elliot said under his breath. "It's here. I can feel it." They passed what looked like a makeshift lab, its windows shattered, the room filled with strange, glowing equipment. Elliot paused for a moment, scanning the room for any signs of recent activity. The room was clearly abandoned, but it gave him an uneasy feeling. It looked like something had been going on here, something that had led to the creation of the skinwalkers. "Let's move on," Maria said, her voice tight with unease. "This place gives me the creeps." They continued forward, moving cautiously through the maze of dark hallways. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed from above, a screeching, rattling sound that made their blood run cold. "They're above us," one of the survivors muttered, his voice quivering with fear. Elliot nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. "We need to hurry. If we're going to stop this, we have to get to the central control room." They picked up the pace, moving faster now, urgency in their steps. As they rounded another corner, they came to a large metal door. The room beyond it was sealed off, but the signs of struggle were evident: bloodstains, overturned chairs, and the remnants of a battle fought long ago. Elliot approached the door cautiously. "This is it. The heart of the operation." He pushed the door open with a creak, and the group filed into the room. What they found inside was beyond anything they had imagined. The central control room was a massive, dark chamber, with several rows of computers and machinery still humming with life. Screens flickered with strange data, lines of code running endlessly across the monitors. But what caught their attention was the large tank at the center of the room, filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Inside the tank was something horrifying. A creature, still alive, its eyes flickering with a sinister light. It was humanoid, but its form was twisted, grotesque. It had the features of a man, but its skin was a sickly green, its body covered in scars and tumors. Tubes ran from its body to various machines, pumping the dark liquid in and out. The creature was clearly some sort of experiment, a failed creation, or perhaps the beginning of something far more terrifying. "This is it," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where it all started." Elliot felt a chill run down his spine. The creature in the tank wasn't just a monster. It was a key, the key to understanding how the skinwalkers were created, and perhaps the key to stopping them. "We need to destroy it," Elliot said, his voice filled with determination. "If we kill whatever's behind this, maybe we can end this nightmare." But as they prepared to act, the ground shook beneath them. A loud roar echoed from deep within the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. "We've been spotted," one of the survivors said, panic rising in their voice. Elliot gritted his teeth. "Then we fight. We end this now." End of Part 4. Let me know if you'd like to continue with Part 5. The roar reverberated through the building, shaking the walls as if the very foundation of the structure was ready to crumble. The survivors exchanged quick glances, the reality of the situation setting in. Whatever had made that sound was close, and it was coming for them. Elliot's grip tightened on his rifle, his mind racing. "We need to hold this room," he said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. We can't let them get to the creature. If we can take it down, maybe the skinwalkers will stop evolving. Maria, her eyes wide with fear, nodded and pulled out a syringe filled with a glowing green substance. I'm going to try something, she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I don't know if it'll work, but I've been working on this formula. If I can get close enough to the creature, maybe I can neutralize whatever's controlling them. Elliot didn't have time to question her plan. Just make sure you stay safe. We can't afford to lose anyone now. The survivors quickly spread out in the control room, taking cover behind the broken furniture and equipment. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. Whatever was coming, it was big, and it was relentless. Suddenly, the doors to the room burst open with a loud crash. The survivors didn't have time to react before the first skinwalker charged through, its glowing eyes fixated on them. It was followed by more, dozens of them, each one a twisted reflection of the other, moving with a hunger that seemed more intelligent than anything they had ever encountered. Hold your ground! Elliot yelled, as the group opened fire. Bullets ripped through the air, but the skinwalkers didn't fall. They staggered, but their monstrous bodies absorbed the shots, as though they were impervious to pain. The survivors fired again and again, but the creatures kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. Maria didn't wait for the chaos to subside. She moved toward the tank in the center of the room, carefully making her way through the gunfire, her focus solely on the creature inside. It was still alive, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, as if it could sense her presence. Elliot watched her, heart pounding. He knew they didn't have much time. The skinwalkers were multiplying, and the building was quickly becoming a death trap. If they didn't finish what they came for, they would never escape. Cover her! Elliot ordered. The survivors focused their fire on the skinwalkers closest to Maria, trying to create a path for her to reach the tank. The creatures screeched in fury, their sharp claws slashing through the air as they fought back with terrifying force. Maria reached the tank, her hands shaking as she fumbled for a way to release the creature from its restraints. She found a control panel, its buttons flickering with a dim light. Her fingers moved quickly, pressing the buttons with precision despite the fear that clawed at her insides. The liquid inside the tank began to drain, and the creature inside let out a guttural scream, its twisted body writhing in agony. Come on, come on! Maria muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible above the noise of the battle. The skinwalkers were closing in, and it was clear they wouldn't stop until they had torn the survivors apart. Elliot's thoughts raced. He needed to do something, anything, to buy them more time. We need to blow this place, he shouted. We're not going to win a prolonged fight here. We need to make sure they can't use this lab ever again. One of the survivors, a man named Greg, pulled out a bag of explosives. Got it, he said, his face pale but determined. I'll set it up. The tension was thick, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Greg moved toward a set of fuel tanks near the back of the room, quickly attaching the explosives to the structure. He glanced back at Elliot. It's going to be loud. Get ready. Elliot nodded, eyes never leaving the skinwalkers as they advanced, their bloodshot eyes hungry for their next victim. We don't have much time. As the tank drained, the creature inside howled once more. The skinwalkers were now in full frenzy, their attacks becoming more frantic, desperate. Some were even climbing on top of each other, trying to reach Maria and the tank. Maria, get down! Elliot yelled. The medic barely had time to react as a skinwalker leapt toward her, its claws slashing through the air. But before it could reach her, a shot rang out. The skinwalker crumpled to the floor, a bullet lodged in its skull. Nice shot, Greg. Maria called out, grateful for the split-second distraction. With a final, desperate motion, Maria injected the glowing green serum into the creature's exposed veins. The results were immediate. The creature convulsed violently, its body twitching and spasming as if it were being torn apart from the inside. The strange, glowing substance began to spread throughout its veins, and the creature's eyes flickered with an unnatural light before going dark. It collapsed, its once terrifying form now lifeless, its body falling limp against the tank. Maria wiped the sweat from her brow. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Elliot glanced at Greg, who was nearly finished setting the explosives. "How much longer?" "About 30 seconds, Greg replied, his voice steady but urgent. "Move out," Elliot commanded. "We don't have time to wait. Everyone, fall back to the exit. Now." The survivors made a hasty retreat, pushing through the chaos of skinwalkers who were still trying to get to them. Elliot shot a final glance at the now dead creature in the tank before turning and running for the exit. The building was coming down, and they had to get out before it was too late. As they reached the outside, the ground shook again, louder this time. The building began to collapse behind them, sending debris flying into the air. A massive explosion rocked the earth, and the entire structure erupted in a burst of fire and smoke. The shockwave threw them off their feet, but they kept moving, barely escaping the destruction that followed. The survivors regrouped, breathing heavily, covered in dust and sweat. They had made it out alive, for now. But the war for humanity's future had only just begun. End of Part 5. Would you like to continue with Part 6? Let me know. The dust from the explosion lingered in the air, casting a thick, smoky haze over the remains of the lab. The survivors, disoriented but alive, stumbled to their feet, trying to make sense of the destruction around them. The deafening roar of the blast still rang in their ears, but the silence that followed felt even more oppressive. The threat of the skinwalkers, and the horrors they had unleashed, was far from over. Elliot took a moment to catch his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the group, counting heads. They had lost a few in the chaos, but most had made it out alive. Maria was standing next to him, her face pale, her hands still trembling from the ordeal. "Is everyone okay?" Elliot asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Maria nodded, though her eyes were filled with a grim understanding. "We made it out, but I don't think we're safe." "Not yet." Elliot turned his attention to the horizon, where the smoke from the explosion still rose into the sky. He could see the flicker of distant fires, and the sound of other explosions in the distance. The world around them was falling apart, the nightmare was far from over. "What's our next move?" Greg asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. He was one of the few who had survived the blast, and his face was smeared with dirt and blood from the skirmish inside. "We head north," Elliot replied, his gaze narrowing. "There's a fortified settlement up that way. They might be able to help us. We need to regroup, figure out what the hell happened, and how we stop the skinwalkers from spreading." The group nodded, their expressions grim. The sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows across the ruined landscape. The once thriving cities were now nothing more than husks, the remnants of a society that had collapsed under the weight of the undead. Everywhere they looked, signs of destruction were evident: abandoned vehicles, crumbling buildings, and the occasional body, both human and not. They began moving, cautiously at first, keeping their weapons ready and their eyes peeled for any signs of danger. The last thing they needed was to run into another pack of skinwalkers, or worse, something they couldn't even begin to comprehend. As they trekked through the desolate streets, Elliot's mind raced. The creature they had encountered in the lab, the one in the tank, was more than just an experiment. It was a symbol of what humanity had become in the wake of the apocalypse. They were no longer just fighting for survival against the undead. They were fighting against an enemy that had learned to adapt, to evolve. "This doesn't make sense," Maria muttered, breaking the silence. How could they create something like that? It wasn't just a zombie, it was something else entirely. Something worse. Elliot turned to her, his face grim. "It's not just the zombies we're fighting anymore, Maria. It's whoever's behind all of this. They've found a way to control the infected, to turn them into something smarter, something more dangerous. That means we're facing something far worse than we could have imagined. Greg shook his head. We've been surviving the apocalypse for how long now? And now we find out there's something even worse out there? This is impossible. It's real, Maria said, her voice low but certain. We've seen it with our own eyes. And we need to stop it before it spreads any further. Elliot nodded, his jaw set. I agree. But we need to be careful. We don't know how widespread this is. We don't know how many of those things are out there, or who's controlling them. The group fell silent as they continued their journey. The weight of what they had just witnessed was heavy on their shoulders, and the uncertain future loomed over them like a dark cloud. The world was no longer what it used to be, it had been irreparably changed. And the true enemy wasn't just the zombies anymore. It was the twisted minds who had turned them into weapons. As they made their way through the destroyed city, the group couldn't help but notice the absence of the usual undead groans and growls. The streets, once teeming with the flesh-hungry creatures, were eerily quiet. But that only made the tension more palpable. There was no sign of movement, no indication of danger. It was too quiet. Something's wrong, Greg whispered, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Elliot paused, his instincts telling him to stay alert. Stay close. Don't let your guard down. They continued forward, every step filled with uncertainty. As they reached the edge of the city, Elliot looked back over his shoulder. He could see the faint glow of the fire from the explosion, still burning in the distance. It was a reminder of the hell they had just escaped, and a warning of what was to come. But even as they moved toward the safety of the northern settlement, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was waiting for them. The skinwalkers were only the beginning. They had only scratched the surface of the horrors that lay ahead. They couldn't stop now. The fight for the future of humanity had just begun. End of Part 6. Would you like to continue with Part 7? Let me know. The silence around them was suffocating. For hours, the survivors moved through the decimated landscape, their footsteps the only sound amidst the eerie stillness. The streets, once filled with the chaos of the undead, were now unnervingly quiet. Every now and then, the wind would blow a piece of debris across their path, or a distant rumble would echo in the sky, but otherwise, it felt as though the world itself had frozen. Elliot kept his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The quiet was unnerving, and every part of him screamed that it was too good to be true. They had survived the worst, the lab, the skinwalkers, and the explosion. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was still lurking, waiting for them to drop their guard. They approached a small, fortified outpost at the outskirts of the ruined city. It was a makeshift settlement, constructed from scavenged materials, with walls of scrap metal and wooden planks. A handful of survivors manned the perimeter, their eyes wary as the group approached. Elliot raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "We come in peace," he called out. "We need help. We're survivors of the outbreak." The guards eyed them suspiciously but didn't immediately raise their weapons. One of them, a woman with short, dark hair, stepped forward. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "And why are you here?" "We've been through hell," Maria said, her voice hoarse from the days of fighting and running. "We've seen things, creatures that shouldn't exist. We need shelter, food, and answers." The guard's eyes flickered with recognition. "Creatures? You mean the skinwalkers?" She glanced nervously at the others. "You're lucky you made it this far. Not many do." "We've been fighting them," Greg said, his voice strained. "We need to know more. How do we stop them?" The guard hesitated before lowering her rifle. "It's a long story. But you're right about one thing, the skinwalkers are just the beginning. We've seen a lot worse out there. Worse than anything we could have imagined." Elliot stepped forward, urgency in his voice. Then tell us everything you know. We don't have much time. We're all that's left. The guard led them into the settlement, where a few survivors had gathered around a fire. A large map was spread out on a table, with various locations marked in red. This, she said, pointing to the map, is where things went wrong. The survivors crowded around the map, studying the locations. We've been tracking the skinwalkers for months, the guard continued. They've been spreading across the country, but there's something even worse happening. People, not infected, not zombies, but people, are controlling them. We think they've found a way to breed them, create armies. And they're using them to hunt down the last survivors of the human race. Elliot frowned, his stomach tightening. Who are they? Where did they come from? We don't know, the guard said. But we believe they're part of a larger organization. A shadow group, maybe military or government, who are using the skinwalkers and other creatures as weapons. The outbreak wasn't just an accident. It was engineered. And they've been refining their creations ever since. Maria's eyes widened. So it wasn't just a virus? Someone planned all of this? Exactly, the guard replied. And they're still out there, trying to perfect their experiments. We've seen their operations firsthand. They've been testing different strains of the virus, different ways of controlling the infected. It's only a matter of time before they perfect it. The weight of the words hit the survivors like a ton of bricks. The fight for survival had just become something far more complex and terrifying. The skinwalkers were just a small part of the bigger picture. There were forces at work, hidden in the shadows, that no one fully understood. What do we do now? Greg asked, his voice tight with disbelief. We fight, Elliot said, his voice grim but determined. We've come this far, and we're not stopping now. We need to find out who's behind this, take them down, and stop the spread of this nightmare once and for all. The guard nodded, her eyes flickering with something close to hope. There's a research facility north of here. It's heavily guarded, but it's the heart of everything, where the experiment started. If you can get in, you might be able to find the answers we need. Elliot exchanged a look with his group. They had just survived one hellish encounter, and now they were being sent on a mission to infiltrate the heart of the enemy's operation. The risks were high, but the stakes were even higher. How do we get in? Maria asked, already anticipating the dangers they would face. We have a contact inside, the guard said. A scientist who managed to escape the facility. He's been helping us gather intel. He can guide you through the facility, but you'll need to move quickly. They'll be looking for anyone who knows what's going on. The group fell silent for a moment, each of them processing the enormity of what they were about to do. The journey ahead would be treacherous, the odds stacked against them. But they had no choice. The future of humanity depended on them. Elliot stood up, determination hardening his expression. We leave at first light. The survivors gathered their gear, preparing for the next leg of their journey. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers they couldn't even begin to imagine. But they had made it this far. And they weren't about to stop now. As the sun set on the shattered world around them, the survivors of the last human enclave prepared for the battle of their lives. The real war for dead America was just beginning, and it was a war they couldn't afford to lose. End of Part 7. Would you like to continue with Part 8? Let me know. The morning light was barely a whisper on the horizon as the survivors gathered their belongings and set out once more. The fortified settlement they had spent the night in was quiet now, save for the low murmur of the few who had stayed behind. There was no time for goodbyes, no time to savor the comfort of safety. The war for the future of humanity was far from over, and every minute counted. Elliot's group, Maria, Greg, and the few others who had survived the horrors of the skinwalkers, were about to embark on the most dangerous leg of their journey. They had to reach the research facility, locate the scientist, and uncover whatever secrets lay hidden within its walls. It was a mission filled with peril, and they all knew that some might not make it back. The path ahead was treacherous. The roads, long abandoned and overtaken by nature, were a constant reminder of the devastation that had ravaged the world. Every so often, the group would come across signs of life, but not the kind they were hoping for. A lone zombie wandering aimlessly, its body a decaying shell of what it once was. An overturned vehicle, its windows shattered and interior abandoned in haste. The signs of struggle were everywhere, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. As they trekked north, they saw firsthand the extent of the destruction. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Landmarks, once proud symbols of human civilization, now lay in ruins, consumed by time and decay. It was a grim reminder of how far humanity had fallen. But even in the midst of this destruction, there was a glimmer of hope. They had survived, against all odds. They had fought tooth and nail to stay alive. And now, they had a chance to strike back. Around noon, they reached the edge of the facility. It loomed in the distance like a dark monument to mankind's failure. The once pristine laboratories and research buildings had been overrun, their walls scarred by the remnants of countless battles. But even in its decayed state, the facility was still heavily guarded. The enemy, whoever they were, had fortified it, ensuring that no one could get in or out without their knowledge. The contact inside the facility, the scientist who had escaped the clutches of the twisted organization, had provided them with a map of the layout and the best route to infiltrate the building. He had also warned them of the traps and dangers that awaited them. But despite all the warnings, they had no choice but to press forward. There was too much at stake. "Everyone stay sharp," Elliot said, his voice low but firm. "We move in, get to the central lab, and find the answers. If we don't stop them here, they'll keep experimenting, keep refining their weapons, and the world will never be safe again." The group nodded, their faces grim, but filled with the same determination that had brought them this far. They had lost so much, friends, family, even their former lives, but they weren't going to lose this fight. Not now. As they approached the facility's outer perimeter, they noticed movement in the shadows. A pair of heavily armed guards patrolled the area, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The group crouched low, blending into the debris and wreckage around them. They had to be careful, one wrong move, and they would be exposed. Elliot motioned for Greg and Maria to follow him. They would have to take out the guards quietly, incapacitate them without raising the alarm. The rest of the group stayed behind, waiting for the signal to move. The guards were close now, walking past their hiding spot. Elliot's heart raced, but his focus was unwavering. This was the moment of truth. They had no second chances. If they failed here, it would be the end. In a swift, coordinated movement, Elliot and Greg pounced. They tackled the guards to the ground, using their weight to overpower them. Greg's hand clamped over the first guard's mouth, muffling the cry that tried to escape. Maria quickly disarmed the second guard, knocking him unconscious with a blow to the head. The fight was over before it had begun. With the guards neutralized, the group moved forward, slipping into the facility under the cover of darkness. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick in the air. Every corner they turned, every hallway they crossed, could be hiding another threat. But they pushed forward, fueled by the need to finish what they had started. As they reached the central lab, the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the heart of the operation. Inside, rows of computers hummed, and a series of glass tanks filled with strange, grotesque creatures lined the walls. The smell of chemicals and decay filled the air. "This is it," Elliot whispered. "The answers we need are here." They spread out, searching for anything that could provide a clue. It wasn't long before Maria found what they were looking for, a terminal, still active, displaying detailed records of the experiments. The data was extensive, spanning years of research and development. But one entry stood out, a name. Dr. Evan Cross. The scientist responsible for the outbreak, for the creation of the skinwalkers, and for the twisted army of monsters that had ravaged the world. "We need to find him," Elliot said, his voice cold with resolve. "He's the key." But before they could make their next move, the door to the lab slammed shut behind them. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. They weren't alone anymore. Elliot's heart sank as the unmistakable growl of a skinwalker echoed from the shadows. The facility was about to become their final battleground. And the real war for dead America was about to come to an end, one way or another. End of Part 8. This concludes the story 4. They said it was over, but the real war for dead America had just begun. Would you like to work on another story or need help with something else? Let me know.